Hi! In this video I will show you how to analyze the atmosphere in a fictional text. What exactly do we mean when we speak about atmosphere in a fictional text? We don't mean the atmosphere surrounding the planet Earth, of course. We're talking about something that is created in the fiction, in the novel, and whatever it is you're looking at. And I would say that there are some similar terms. Sometimes they're used confusingly in the same way, sometimes slightly differently. I'll explain how I use them here, but sometimes we have words like setting, mood or tone that are used alternatively. I would say that you could define atmosphere as the feeling that is evoked by the narrative presentation of a scene in a fictional text. So my idea is that it focuses on feeling, on something that you feel, rather than, let's say, different categories that you can put something into. It's a bit tricky to really understand what this means and what the author of the text is doing here. So I'd like to make a little detour to show you what this means. When we're looking at art, say here this painting Café Terrasse by Van Gogh, or Van Gogh as the Dutch would say, I would say you look at it and right away you get the impression of a feeling, an atmosphere that is created. And I would say that most people could agree on what this atmosphere is. I would say it's something like joyful. It makes you feel joyful, happy. You would feel comfortable, relaxed, imagining yourself sitting there. And I could also understand if somebody said, well, I think it portrays jealousy because you're jealous of the people there. You're not there on the terrace. It's the other people, or you're looking at it from the outside. So maybe you're lonely and you wish you were there. But I would say nobody would associate this painting with fear or horror or something like that. So the artist has created a set of feelings that we, watching this, can feel and can identify. And of course, I'm going to talk about fictional text and I don't know much about art, but what does the artist do? The artist uses colors. I would say that the light has something to do with it. He uses a certain kind of brush stroke to create this image and to evoke this atmosphere that he wants. Of course, in literature, in fictional text, the artist only has words. So he has to do the same thing that Van Gogh is doing there, only using words. How does that work? I would say you take a setting, you pick a setting as an author, so that means the place where you are, the time that it's taking place in, the objects surrounding the scene. And of course you also have people there, or usually you do. Sometimes you could have a scene without, but I think most of the time there will be characters. You have setting, you have characters, and both of these are described, of course, through language. So they don't exist as such. Let's say, like the analogy to the painting here would be, it's not a photograph of something that really exists, but these are portrayed through the language that the author uses. So the author uses setting, characters, describes them in a specific language, specific perspective, etc., to create an atmosphere that we are going to feel when we read this excerpt. When you're writing, now say you have a task, you're given the task to simply analyze the atmosphere or analyze the atmosphere focusing on something specific. How should you go about it? Well, first of all, there's, to my mind, there's a difference between an introductory sentence and a transition sentence or paragraph. If you're writing a text that stands by itself, only in analysis, you would need a real introduction. By introduction, I mean name, the author, the title of the novel, possibly the year when it was published, etc. To my mind, you don't need this in a transition. A transition means before you have the analysis, you had a summary already where you had this introductory sentence. So I'll focus on the transition sentence here. It should include the most striking feelings that the atmosphere evokes when you're reading it. And to list these, you can use nouns or adjective. Here I have nouns. The excerpt conveys an atmosphere of loneliness and oppression. Or you could do the same thing with adjectives. The excerpt creates a tense and desperate atmosphere. And you should name the main techniques used to create this atmosphere, and sometimes you are given a focus already in the task, so you can refer to that with the use of rhetorical devices or using narrative techniques. Of course, if you mention something here, you need to be talking about it later on in the main part. So what you're writing down in this transitional introduction shows what you will be doing later on, so that of course needs to fit nicely together. Sometimes you have excerpts where an atmosphere changes from a beginning where it's like this and an end where it's different. In this case, of course, it makes sense to mention that here in this transitional introduction. An example for a sentence that I would think would fit there is this. And I'm focusing here on The Handmaid's Tale. It's a novel by Margaret Atwood that's also been turned into a series. And I'll focus only on chapter 1, and there are 2 paragraphs, so just in case you want to look this up. It could sound something like this. In this excerpt, Margaret Atwood conveys a feeling of loneliness and oppression by using both narrative technique and rhetorical devices. So the reader would know immediately I'm going to talk about these 2 feelings, how they're created, loneliness, oppression, and I will be looking at narrative technique and rhetorical devices. When you're writing the main part, I would say that there's a certain formula to it. Of course, you should be using paragraphs that you can visibly see on the page and that contain sort of one focus each. And for each of these paragraphs, I would say it should include the following points. It should name the feeling that is created by something. It should name the device or the technique that creates this feeling. And there should be a quote from the text or reference to the text showing where this can be found. And of course, importantly, you should explain the function of this device, this technique here in this excerpt. What does it do for the atmosphere, to create the atmosphere in the end? And this is of course the most tricky part, this last point. Let me give you an example for a paragraph that looks at one of these points. This sense of oppression is strengthened by the repetition, here I'm naming the device, of the phrase "weren't allowed," so this is the reference. It thus becomes clear that the girls' freedoms are severely restricted, as it is impossible for them to leave the building. However, strong rules also dictate the actions of others, as it is also forbidden for the guards to enter the building. The society the characters inhabit seems to dictate the roles of individuals strictly. So the idea is, in this tricky green part, to connect the feeling that is created, a feeling of oppression, with the device, repetition, and the proof for it in yellow, and explain what this together does. And here, as is in the text, I would say it creates this idea of a society that is very strict and doesn't allow certain things, and describe this here with other adjectives. Sometimes you need to write a conclusion. This really depends on your teacher, your professor, or the exact text form you're supposed to write. Some people like a conclusion in a text like this. Some people would say it's not absolutely necessary. It depends. And if you write one, it should be a rather short statement. It should not list again all the points that you had before. And it should also not repeat the introduction exactly or very closely. What it should do is it should refer back to the task. So if you, in the beginning, in the introduction, you set about to look at narrative techniques and rhetorical devices, this should be mentioned here one way or another. And it should sum up what you found, but not by repeating it, but by combining your findings and saying it on a more abstract level. An example for this, something I have created here, would be, in conclusion, narrative techniques and stylistic devices. This was the focus listed before in the introduction. I used to emphasize the contrast between the girls' hopes and the confinement, oppression, and isolation they experience. So imagine I have looked at these different points before, and then I'm summing this up together to show the overall effect of these devices. I hope that helped you to learn how to write an analysis of atmosphere in a fictional text. You can take a look on my channel. There are a couple of other videos on similar topics. Maybe something will come in handy at some point for you. I would be glad to see you again here. See you soon. Goodbye.